The encounter. Marcus Davis reclined on a weathered park bench in Riverside Park, the sun casting a golden hue on the lush greenery that surrounded him. The pages of his book fluttered gently in the afternoon breeze as he immersed himself in the story, momentarily escaping the demands of his high-stakes job with the FBI. He cherished these quiet moments, where the laughter of children and the rustling of leaves enveloped him in a cocoon of tranquility. Unbeknownst to Marcus, a shadow loomed over his peaceful retreat. Officer Brian Harkins patrolled the park, his sharp eyes scanning for any signs of trouble. After 2 decades on the force, he had honed his instincts, and today something felt off. As he passed Marcus, an unsettling sensation washed over him, a suspicion rooted in the deep-seated biases he often tried to ignore. "Never seen him around here before," Brian muttered to himself, his gaze fixated on the solitary figure reading on the bench. Marcus, a black man, exuded an air of calm that Brian found disconcerting. He thought of the vague reports of a suspect fitting the general description, a flimsy justification for his unease. Marcus felt the weight of scrutiny and looked up from his book, locking eyes with Brian. The officer's expression was one he had encountered many times before, a mix of suspicion and authority, cloaked in a facade of concern. Marcus, however, refused to flinch. Instead, he marked his place in the book and met the officer's gaze with unwavering composure. "Afternoon," Brian said, forcing a polite tone despite the tension brewing beneath the surface. "Afternoon," Marcus replied, his voice steady. He kept his hands visible on the bench, a silent gesture of non-aggression, understanding the precarious nature of their encounter. "What brings you out here today?" Brian asked, feigning casual interest. His eyes flicked to the book, searching for any sign of wrongdoing. "Just enjoying the park," Marcus said simply. It was a beautiful day, and he refused to allow prejudice to ruin it. Brian nodded slowly, though he barely registered Marcus's response. He scrutinized the man in front of him, looking for anything to justify the gnawing suspicion festering in his gut. "You from around here?" he pressed, hoping to elicit a revealing answer. "I've been around," Marcus replied, his smile polite but guarded. The officer's brow furrowed. The non-answer only fueled his discomfort. "Mind if I see some ID?" he demanded, his voice taking on a more authoritative edge. At that moment, Marcus felt the tension spiral. He knew his rights and understood that he was not legally obliged to present identification for merely sitting in a public park. Yet the atmosphere was charged, and he was acutely aware of how quickly things could escalate. "Am I under arrest?" Marcus asked, his tone measured. He remained unfazed, determined not to give the officer the reaction he craved. Brian bristled at the question. "You will be if you don't cooperate," he shot back, his hand instinctively moving toward his holster. The veiled threat hung heavy in the air. "I'm just sitting in a park," Marcus said, his voice calm. "Is there a law against that?" Brian's frustration mounted as he sensed his control slipping. "You fit the description of someone we're looking for," he retorted, knowing full well how flimsy the excuse sounded. He stepped closer, invading Marcus's space, trying to establish dominance. "What description is that?" Marcus inquired, his gaze steady. Brian's jaw tightened. He had no solid answer, but admitting that would mean exposing his own insecurity. "Don't get smart with me," he snapped, his voice edged with anger. "Show me some ID now." The two men stood locked in a tense standoff, the weight of the situation pressing down on them. Marcus knew he could push back, assert his rights, but he also recognized the potential danger in doing so. After a moment's hesitation, he reached into his pocket slowly, deliberately, ensuring that his movements were non-threatening. He pulled out his wallet and handed over his ID, maintaining eye contact with Brian the entire time. Brian snatched the ID from Marcus's hand and glanced at it, but the name meant nothing to him. The arrest was already etched in his mind. "Stand up," he ordered abruptly, stepping back to create space. Marcus sighed inwardly, but he complied, rising slowly from the bench with his hands visible. He knew that any sudden movement could provoke a hostile reaction. "Turn around," Brian commanded, pulling out a pair of handcuffs. Frustration surged within Marcus, but he pushed it down, knowing that the best course of action was to remain calm. He turned, allowing Brian to cuff him without resistance. The crowd nearby watched in hushed silence, eyes wide with disbelief, but Marcus held his head high, knowing that the situation did not define him. As the handcuffs bit into his wrists, Marcus felt a familiar weariness wash over him, one that transcended this particular encounter. It was the fatigue of being constantly viewed through the lens of prejudice, despite his accomplishments and the respect he had earned in his career. Brian grabbed Marcus's arm and began leading him toward the patrol car parked nearby. The weight of the world pressed on Marcus as they walked, his thoughts racing through the implications of this moment. He wasn't worried about himself. He was an FBI agent after all. But he felt the heavy cloak of societal judgment draped over him. As they reached the patrol car, Brian opened the back door and guided Marcus inside. The metal was cold against his skin, a stark reminder of the reality he was now facing. He settled into the seat, the handcuffs still pressing against his wrists, and looked out the window as the car pulled away from the park. The trees blurred past, their vibrant colors a stark contrast to the gray cloud of injustice hanging over him. The engine hummed as Officer Brian Harkins drove Marcus toward the precinct, his grip on the steering wheel tightening. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was off, a gnawing sense of doubt that had begun to creep in since the moment he had approached Marcus. "What were you really doing in that park?" he asked, his voice edged with suspicion as he glanced at Marcus in the rearview mirror. "I told you," Marcus replied calmly. "I was just reading." Brian scoffed, dismissing Marcus's explanation. "A guy like you just sitting around reading. You expect me to believe that?" Marcus raised an eyebrow, sensing the veiled implications. "A guy like me," he repeated, his tone measured. Brian hesitated, the weight of his own words pressing down on him. He was aware of the implication, but refused to confront it. "You don't look like someone who spends his afternoons reading in the park," he muttered, desperately trying to justify his actions. Marcus remained silent for a moment, allowing the tension to build. "And what does someone like me look like, officer?" he finally asked, his voice cool and controlled. Brian didn't respond. He couldn't. The question lingered in the air, heavy with the unspoken truths that surrounded them. As they pulled into the precinct's parking lot, Brian parked near the entrance and exited the vehicle. He opened the back door, helping Marcus out while the cuffs dug into his wrists. Marcus felt the eyes of other officers on him, their curious glances boring into him as they walked toward the building. Brian ignored their stares, lost in his own thoughts, struggling to reconcile his actions with the creeping sense of doubt that was now gnawing at his conscience. Inside the precinct, the usual buzz of activity filled the air. Officers filing reports, phones ringing, the hum of conversations. Brian led Marcus through the main hall, trying to maintain an air of authority despite the mounting uncertainty. They'd reached the booking area, where Officer Jenkins, a young man behind the processing desk, looked up in surprise. "What's this about?" Jenkins asked, his eyes flicking from Marcus to Brian, confusion evident on his face. "Caught him acting suspicious in the park," Brian replied, his tone clipped. He handed over Marcus's ID, unwilling to admit that he had no solid reason for the arrest. Jenkins glanced at the ID, recognition flickering in his eyes before he quickly masked it. He nodded, beginning to type into the computer. As he processed the information, Marcus felt the weight of the moment press down on him. He was an FBI agent, yet here he was, trapped in a scenario that echoed the painful history of countless others before him. Would the truth emerge? Would justice prevail, or would he be just another statistic in a system riddled with bias? The tension in the room thickened as Marcus prepared for what was to come. The day had taken a turn he had not anticipated, but he knew he had the strength to rise above it. He was determined to reclaim his narrative, to turn this moment of injustice into a powerful testament of resilience. And little did Officer Harkins know that the man he had just arrested was not only an agent of the law, but a force for justice, ready to fight against the very biases that had ensnared him. The unraveling truth. As Marcus sat in the back of the patrol car, the engine hummed quietly, but the tension in the air crackled like a live wire. He could feel the oppressive weight of the handcuffs biting into his wrists, a constant reminder of the injustice he was facing. The world outside the windows sped by, but in his mind, time felt suspended. Memories of his life, of his accomplishments, and of the values he held dear played on a loop, juxtaposed against the harsh reality of being wrongfully detained. Marcus had worked hard to build a reputation as a dedicated FBI agent. His career had been marked by tenacity and intelligence, often navigating high-pressure situations with grace. Yet, as he sat there, he couldn't help but feel stripped of his identity. The badge that he wore with pride had seemingly been rendered irrelevant, replaced by the skin he inhabited, the very thing that had drawn Officer Harkins' ire. The patrol car pulled into the precinct's parking lot, and Brian Harkins stepped out first. He opened the back door, his expression a mix of determination and uncertainty. "Let's go," he ordered, his voice lacking the authority he usually projected. He helped Marcus out of the car, the cuffs digging into Marcus's wrists as he guided him toward the building. Inside the precinct, the atmosphere was electric with the sounds of ringing phones and the chatter of officers filing reports. Marcus noticed the way the other officers looked at him, their expressions a blend of curiosity and disbelief. He felt the heat of their stares, but he held his head high, refusing to let their judgment define him. As they walked through the main hall, Brian led Marcus to the booking area. "Stand by the desk," he instructed, his tone clipped as he gestured to Officer Jenkins, who was still busy typing away at the computer. "Hey, Brian," Jenkins greeted without looking up. "What's going on?" "Caught him acting suspicious in the park," Brian replied, the defensiveness creeping into his voice. He felt the weight of Marcus's ID in his hand, a silent testament to the man he had judged far too quickly. Jenkins paused, finally glancing up at Marcus, his eyes widening with recognition. "Wait a minute. Marcus Davis." He turned to Brian, confusion evident on his face. "Isn't he with the FBI?" Brian felt his stomach drop. He hadn't anticipated this. "Yeah, but he was acting suspicious." "Acting suspicious," Jenkins interrupted, disbelief in his tone. "You know this guy. He's been in the news for his work with the Bureau. He was part of that major drug bust last year." Marcus stood there, a mix of emotions swirling within him. Relief flooded through him at Jenkins' recognition, but anger simmered beneath the surface at being subjected to such humiliation. "Yes, I'm with the FBI," he said calmly, his voice steady despite the storm inside him. "I was just reading in the park, and now I'm being treated like a criminal." Brian's face paled as he processed Jenkins's words. The weight of his earlier assumptions crashed down on him, and for the first time, he felt the cold sting of regret. I didn't know," he stammered, glancing between Marcus and Jenkins, trying to regain his composure. "I thought he was someone else." "Someone else?" Jenkins echoed, his disbelief morphing into irritation. "You mean someone who fit a stereotype?" "This is ridiculous, Brian. You can't just stop people for existing." Brian fumbled for words, but the weight of his own biases had come crashing down like a house of cards. The righteous indignation he had felt moments ago began to evaporate, replaced by an uncomfortable recognition of the flaws in his judgment. "You have to understand. I've been on this beat for years," he said, desperation lacing his voice. "I've seen things. I thought I was just being cautious." Marcus took a breath, his anger tempered by the realization that the officer was wrestling with his own internal conflicts. "Caution should never translate into bias," he said, his tone firm but measured. "I am a human being deserving of respect, regardless of my race or where I happen to be reading a book." Jenkins nodded, visibly uncomfortable with the unfolding situation. "Let's just process this correctly. "Brian, you need to step back. We'll sort this out." Brian sighed, the weight of his choices pressing down on him. He stepped away from the desk, allowing Jenkins to take over. "Fine," he muttered, his pride wounded. Jenkins turned to Marcus, his expression softening. "I'm really sorry about this. We'll get you sorted out in no time. Do you have your badge on you?" Marcus nodded, pulling his badge from his pocket. He could feel the tension in the air begin to dissipate, but the damage had already been done. The experience weighed heavily on him. It wasn't just a personal affront, but a reminder of the systemic issues that plagued society. As Jenkins entered Marcus's information into the system, Marcus couldn't help but reflect on how such a simple day had spiraled into chaos. He thought of the countless individuals who faced similar situations, many of whom weren't as fortunate to have their identity recognized. It was a cycle that perpetuated fear, misunderstanding, and bias. Once Jenkins finished processing the information, he turned back to Marcus. "Everything checks out," he said, relief evident in his voice. "I'm really sorry for the mix-up. I'll have you out of here shortly." Brian stood off to the side, his demeanor shifting from defensive to contemplative. The embarrassment of his actions settled in, a heavy weight he would have to carry. He had misjudged Marcus not only as an individual but as a representative of a community that often bore the brunt of systemic bias. "Marcus," he said, his voice softer now, "I'm sorry for what happened. I let my assumptions cloud my judgment." Marcus regarded him, unsure of how to respond. He was tired of empty apologies. They did little to change the circumstances. "This isn't just about an apology," he replied, his voice steady. "It's about understanding the deeper issues at play. It's about recognizing that biases are often learned behaviors that can be unlearned through education and empathy." Brian nodded, processing Marcus's words. "You're right. I've got to do better. We all do." As they continued their conversation, the atmosphere in the precinct shifted from one of tension to one of introspection. Other officers began to gather around, curious about the unfolding scene. Some whispered to one another, while others listened intently. Marcus took this moment as an opportunity to speak up. Every day, countless individuals face judgment based solely on their appearance. It's a reality that many people don't experience, but it's one I live with constantly. This isn't just about me. It's about everyone who has been unfairly treated due to the color of their skin. His words hung in the air, resonating with those who were listening. A few officers nodded in understanding, their expressions shifting from curiosity to reflection. "I appreciate your willingness to share this," Jenkins said. "It takes courage to speak up, especially in situations like this. We should all strive to be better allies." Marcus felt a sense of purpose ignite within him. Perhaps this moment of injustice could serve as a catalyst for change. "Education is key," he asserted. "We need to engage in conversations that challenge our perceptions and biases. Only then can we begin to build a more equitable society." As he spoke, he could see the wheels turning in Brian's mind. The officer was grappling with the realization that his actions had consequences, not just for Marcus, but for himself and the community he served. "Marcus," Brian said, his voice filled with sincerity, "thank you for being willing to have this conversation. I've learned something today. It's crucial that I reflect on my actions and their impact." With that, the atmosphere shifted from one of tension to one of potential. Marcus knew that change would take time, but the willingness of Brian and others to engage in difficult conversations was a step in the right direction. Just as the tension began to dissipate, a commotion erupted from the front of the precinct. The doors burst open, and a group of concerned citizens entered, their voices raised in protest. They had heard about Marcus's unjust detention, and they were there to stand in solidarity with him. "Let him go," one person shouted, their voice ringing with conviction. "This is an injustice that needs to stop." Marcus turned, his heart swelling with gratitude at the sight of those willing to stand up against systemic bias. The voices of the community began to rise in unison, a chorus of support that filled the precinct with an undeniable energy. "Enough is enough," another voice cried out. "We're tired of being treated like criminals for simply existing." Brian's expression shifted from embarrassment to a sense of urgency. He glanced at Jenkins, who was equally taken aback. They both understood that the situation was evolving. And it was now about more than just Marcus. It was a larger issue that needed addressing. As the crowd gathered, chanting for justice, Marcus felt a profound sense of solidarity. He realized that this was not just his fight. It was a collective struggle against prejudice and injustice. He stepped forward, determined to address the crowd. "Thank you all for being here," he began, his voice steady and strong. "What happened to me is not an isolated incident. It's part of a broader pattern that many face every day. We must come together to demand change and hold those in power accountable." The crowd erupted in cheers, their voices lifting his spirit. In that moment, Marcus felt a renewed sense of purpose. It was not just about proving his innocence. It was about igniting a movement for justice and equality. "Let's continue this conversation," Marcus urged, looking at Brian and Jenkins. "We need to work together to ensure that no one else has to endure what I just experienced." The officers nodded, understanding the gravity of the situation. This moment could serve as a turning point, not just for Marcus, but for the entire community. As the voices of protest filled the precinct, Marcus knew that together they could challenge the status quo and create a future where individuals were judged not by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. And as he stood there, surrounded by supporters, he felt hope bloom in the midst of injustice, a reminder that change was possible when voices came together in solidarity. The ripple effect. The cacophony of voices filled the precinct, reverberating off the walls and creating an electric atmosphere charged with urgency. As Marcus stood at the front, surrounded by a growing crowd of supporters, he felt a surge of determination. This moment transcended his personal experience. It was a call to action for everyone who had ever faced discrimination or injustice. "Thank you all for being here," Marcus began again, his voice strong and unwavering. "Your presence matters. It shows that we are not alone in this fight. Today, we stand against not just a misunderstanding, but a systemic issue that affects countless individuals every day." The crowd murmured in agreement, their solidarity palpable. As Marcus continued, he could see the faces of those around him. Some were young, others older, but they all shared a common thread of frustration and hope. "This is a turning point," he declared. "Together, we can change the narrative and challenge the assumptions that lead to injustice." Brian Harkins, still standing at the side, felt the weight of Marcus's words settle on him. He had come to realize that his role in this situation extended far beyond mere law enforcement. It was about being a responsible member of society. The voices of the crowd reminded him of the power of community and the importance of empathy in policing. As the crowd cheered, Marcus felt a sense of empowerment wash over him. He was no longer just an individual subjected to bias. He was a voice for the voiceless. "We need to engage in honest conversations," he continued, "conversations that challenge the stereotypes and biases that lead to situations like mine. It's not enough to apologize. We must actively work to dismantle the prejudices that are deeply ingrained in our society." Officer Jenkins stood by, taking notes as Marcus spoke. He recognized the significance of the moment, not just for Marcus, but for the entire precinct. He knew that change could start here, within their own ranks, if they were willing to confront uncomfortable truths. As the crowd continued to rally around Marcus, some began to share their own stories of profiling, of being misunderstood, and of the daily struggles faced by people of color. Each narrative added layers to the conversation, transforming it into a rich tapestry of shared experiences. A young woman stepped forward, her voice trembling but fierce. "I was stopped just last week for looking suspicious while walking home from my job," she shared, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "I was just tired from working a long shift, yet I was treated like a criminal. It's exhausting living in fear because of the color of my skin." Marcus nodded, recognizing the fatigue in her voice. "You're not alone," he reassured her. "Your experience reflects a reality that many face daily. Together, we can challenge this system and demand accountability." As more people spoke out, a palpable shift occurred in the precinct. Brian, once defensive and resistant to change, began to see the urgency of the moment. He moved closer to the crowd, his posture shifting from that of a bystander to an ally. He wanted to understand, to learn from the very community he had wronged. The protests outside the precinct escalated, gaining momentum as more supporters arrived. News crews began to gather, capturing the scene that had unfolded, a peaceful demonstration demanding justice and understanding. Marcus knew that their message was resonating far beyond the walls of the precinct. It had the potential to ignite a movement. "Let's take this conversation to the next level," he suggested, glancing at Brian and Jenkins. "We need to invite community leaders, activists, and police officers to sit down together and discuss these issues openly. It's not just about individual incidents. It's about transforming the culture of policing." Jenkins nodded enthusiastically. "I can help organize that," he said. "We can set up community forums where everyone can voice their concerns and work towards solutions together." Brian felt a sense of relief wash over him. He could see that the tide was turning, that the momentum was shifting towards something greater than any one individual. "I'll bring this up with my superiors," he said, his voice steady. "We need to make this a priority within the department." As the crowd erupted in cheers, Marcus felt a swell of hope. This was more than just a reaction to his unjust arrest. It was the beginning of a larger movement, one that could change the way policing was done in their community. With the crowd behind him, Marcus turned to Brian. "We need to commit to real change," he emphasized. "It's not enough to talk. We need to create action plans, training sessions, and ongoing education for all officers." Brian nodded, determination etched on his face. "Absolutely. We have to hold ourselves accountable. We need to ensure that every officer understands the impact of their actions and the importance of community relationships." As the dialogue continued, Marcus noticed how the energy shifted from frustration to empowerment. It was a reminder that change often starts from uncomfortable conversations, and that growth comes from recognizing one's own biases and working to overcome them. As the hours passed, Marcus found himself standing shoulder to shoulder with his supporters, officers and community members alike. The precinct had become a hub of dialogue and action, where voices once silenced were now amplified. By evening, the rally began to wind down, but the conversations didn't stop. People exchanged contact information, vowing to keep the momentum alive. Marcus felt a sense of pride as he looked around. They were building a community united in their pursuit of justice and equality. As they prepared to leave, Marcus stepped forward once more. "Thank you all for your bravery and support today. This is just the beginning. We've started a conversation, but we must continue it. Together, we can change lives and create a future where everyone is treated with dignity and respect." The crowd erupted into applause, a chorus of agreement ringing in his ears. They were ready to stand together, to challenge the status quo, and to push for a future free from bias and discrimination. As he left the precinct that evening, Marcus felt the cool night air brush against his skin, refreshing and invigorating. He knew that the road ahead would be long and fraught with challenges, but he was no longer walking it alone. He had a community beside him, ready to fight for justice and change. And as the first stars twinkled in the darkening sky, he felt a renewed sense of purpose, a commitment to continue this fight, not just for himself, but for all those who had been silenced for too long. The journey was just beginning, and he was determined to see it through. The turning tide. The following week marked a pivotal moment in the ongoing dialogue surrounding police-community relations. The precinct had become a gathering place for discussions, strategy meetings, and community forums aimed at bridging the gap between law enforcement and the residents they served. Marcus Davis found himself at the center of this movement, a catalyst for change that was beginning to ripple throughout the community. As the sun rose over the city, casting a golden light on the precinct's brick facade, Marcus prepared for the first official community forum. He had spent the past few days coordinating with Officer Jenkins and other community leaders to ensure the event would foster honest dialogue. They had created a safe space where residents could voice their concerns, share their experiences, and propose actionable solutions to combat systemic bias. The precinct buzzed with anticipation as community members filed in, their faces reflecting a mix of hope and trepidation. Marcus stood at the front of the room, feeling the weight of expectation on his shoulders. He looked out at the audience, familiar faces from the rally, neighbors he had known for years, and even some officers who had previously kept their distance. This was an opportunity for genuine connection, and he was determined to make it count. "Welcome, everyone," Marcus began, his voice steady. "Thank you for being here today. This forum is not just about discussing the past, it's about shaping our future together. I believe we can foster a relationship built on trust, transparency, and mutual respect." As the crowd settled, he introduced Officer Jenkins, who stood beside him, visibly nervous but ready to engage. Officer Jenkins will help facilitate our discussions. He's committed to understanding the community's concerns and ensuring that our voices are heard. Jenkins took a deep breath, his heart racing. "Thank you, Marcus," he said, glancing around the room. "I appreciate everyone taking the time to join us. We want this to be a two-way conversation, so please feel free to share your thoughts and experiences." The forum began with community members sharing their stories. One by one, they recounted instances of profiling, unwarranted stops, and the fear that came with simply living in their own neighborhoods. A middle-aged man stood up, his voice trembling but resolute. "I was pulled over for a broken taillight, and instead of just a warning, I was treated like a criminal. It felt like I was being punished for something that didn't deserve such a response." Marcus listened intently, nodding in understanding. "What you're sharing is a reality that far too many people face. It's important that we address these issues directly and work towards change. Your experiences are valid, and they deserve to be heard." As the dialogue unfolded, tensions began to dissipate. Attendees spoke not only of their grievances, but also of their hopes for a better future. A young woman named Sarah shared her experience as a college student. "I'm often scared to walk home at night because I don't know how someone will perceive me. I shouldn't have to live in fear. I want to feel safe in my own community," she said, her voice breaking slightly. Marcus felt the weight of her words. "You should feel safe, Sarah. It's essential for us to create an environment where everyone feels secure, regardless of their background." This forum is the first step in that direction. As the discussions continued, some officers, including Brian Harkins, began to share their own perspectives. Brian stood up, his heart racing as he addressed the crowd. "I want to apologize for my actions last week," he said, his voice steady yet vulnerable. "I let my biases cloud my judgment. I didn't see Marcus as a person. I saw a stereotype. I'm committed to doing better and understanding the community I serve." The room filled with murmurs of surprise and appreciation. It was rare for an officer to acknowledge their mistakes publicly, and Brian's admission resonated with many in the audience. Marcus admired Brian's willingness to be vulnerable. It was a necessary step towards rebuilding trust. As the forum progressed, the conversations turned towards solutions. People began brainstorming ways to improve community-police relations. Ideas flowed freely, from community policing initiatives to more comprehensive diversity training for officers. One resident suggested forming a community advisory board that would work directly with the precinct to address issues and hold officers accountable. "I love that idea," Marcus said, excitement filling his voice. A community advisory board would empower residents to have a say in the policing processes. It's crucial for us to work collaboratively. As the forum drew to a close, the sense of hope in the room was palpable. People were not just sharing their stories. They were taking ownership of the change they wished to see. Marcus felt a swell of pride as he witnessed the community coming together, united in their quest for justice. After the forum, The energy in the precinct lingered, a stark contrast to the previous week's tension. People mingled, exchanging contact information and forming connections that would carry the momentum forward. Marcus felt a sense of responsibility to keep the dialogue alive, and he committed to organizing follow-up meetings to ensure that the conversations continued. Later that week, as Marcus prepared for another meeting, he received an unexpected call from his supervisor at the FBI. The tone was serious, and Marcus felt a flutter of apprehension in his chest. "Marcus, I wanted to talk to you about the situation from last week," his supervisor began. "We've been following the developments, and I'm impressed with how you've handled things. We want to support you in this effort." Marcus took a breath, surprised by the unexpected turn of events. "Thank you. I appreciate that. I believe we have an opportunity to create real change, not just in our community but within the Bureau as well." His supervisor nodded, acknowledging the gravity of the moment. "We want to ensure that our agents are trained not just in enforcement, but in community engagement and understanding. I'd like to propose a pilot program where we can bring in community leaders and residents to help educate our agents on the issues they face." Excitement bubbled within Marcus. That sounds like an incredible opportunity. It's crucial for agents to understand the communities they serve, and this could be a groundbreaking initiative. As they discussed the details, Marcus's heart raced with the possibilities that lay ahead. This was a chance to foster change on a larger scale, to ensure that future agents would approach their roles with empathy and understanding rather than bias and assumptions. The days turned into weeks, and the community forums continued to thrive. Each meeting brought new voices, new stories, and new solutions to the table. Marcus felt invigorated by the passion of his community. It was a powerful reminder of the resilience that lay within. One evening, as Marcus left the precinct after a particularly inspiring meeting, he found Brian waiting outside. "Hey, can we talk?" Brian asked, a hint of urgency in his voice. "Of course," Marcus replied, sensing the weight of the conversation. Brian hesitated for a moment, his brow furrowed. "I've been thinking a lot about what we discussed in the forums, the need for change in policing. I want to be a part of that change." Marcus nodded, appreciating Brian's sincerity. "I'm glad to hear that. Change requires commitment from all of us, especially those in positions of authority." "I want to take this a step further," Brian continued, his eyes determined. "I'd like to work with you and the community to develop a training program for our officers, one that emphasizes understanding and empathy over assumptions. I know it's a big undertaking, but I believe it's necessary." Marcus felt a surge of hope. "That's an incredible initiative, Brian. I'd be more than willing to collaborate with you and ensure that community voices are part of the training process." As they discussed the details, the sense of possibility expanded between them. They envisioned a program that would not only educate officers, but also involve community members in training sessions. It was a bold step toward a more inclusive approach to policing, and it held the potential to reshape their precinct for the better. As the weeks rolled on, Marcus and Brian worked tirelessly to bring their vision to life. They gathered community members, activists, and officers to participate in brainstorming sessions, where they crafted a comprehensive training curriculum. The program emphasized cultural awareness, effective communication, and the importance of building trust within the community. The day of the first training session arrived, and Marcus felt a mix of excitement and nervousness. As he stood before a group of officers, he could sense the apprehension in the room. Many had come with reservations, unsure of what to expect from a program that challenged their norms. "Thank you all for being here today," Marcus began, his voice firm but inviting. "This program is about building bridges between law enforcement and the community. We want to create an environment where you can engage with residents in a meaningful way, fostering trust and understanding." As the training progressed, community members shared their experiences with the officers, recounting moments of tension and misunderstanding. The officers listened intently, their expressions shifting from skepticism to understanding as they began to see the human faces behind the stories. By the end of the session, the room buzzed with conversation and ideas. Officers and community members engaged in discussions about how they could work together to address the issues they faced. It was a transformative moment, one that felt like a significant turning point in the ongoing struggle for equity and justice. As the program continued to gain traction, the precinct began to change. Officers who had once been distant started engaging with the community in new ways, attending local events, and participating in neighborhood meetings. The atmosphere shifted from one of suspicion to one of collaboration, and the ripple effect was felt throughout the city. As Marcus reflected on the journey thus far, he felt a profound sense of pride. This was just the beginning of a larger movement, one that challenged the status quo and sought to create a more just and equitable society. Together, they were building a legacy of change, one that would resonate for generations to come. And as the sun set over the city, casting a warm glow over the precinct, Marcus knew that their fight was far from over. But he felt hopeful, buoyed by the knowledge that change was possible when people came together, united by a shared vision of justice and equality. Building a legacy. As the weeks turned into months, the community forums and training sessions became a cornerstone of a movement that was steadily gaining momentum. The precinct had transformed into a hub of activity, where officers and residents worked side by side, united by a shared vision of justice and understanding. Marcus Davis found himself not only at the forefront of this movement, but also serving as a bridge between two worlds that had long been at odds. The pilot training program Marcus and Brian had initiated had exceeded their expectations. Officers were engaging in deep, meaningful conversations about race, bias, and community policing. They learned about the impact of systemic injustice, the importance of cultural competence, and the necessity of empathy in their interactions with residents. One sunny afternoon, Marcus sat in his office at the precinct, preparing for a presentation he would give to the city council later that week. He wanted to showcase the progress made in community relations and advocate for further funding to expand the program. With a stack of notes and statistics laid out before him, he reflected on how far they had come since that fateful day in the park when he had been wrongfully arrested. His phone buzzed, interrupting his thoughts. It was a message from Sarah, the young woman who had shared her story at the forum about her experiences with fear while walking home. "Hey, Marcus, can we meet? I have some ideas for the community events we're planning." Marcus smiled at her enthusiasm. "Absolutely. Let's meet at Riverside Park," he replied. It was a fitting location, the very park where everything had begun. When he arrived, Sarah was already waiting, her notebook open, brimming with ideas. "Thank you for meeting me," she said, her eyes sparkling with determination. "I think we should host a series of community events, things like movie nights, cookouts, and workshops to bring people together. It can help foster relationships and break down barriers." "I love that idea," Marcus replied, feeling inspired by her energy. "Creating spaces where we can interact informally will definitely help build trust. What do you envision for these events?" Sarah began detailing her thoughts, sketching out plans for a summer series of gatherings in the park. "We can start with a community movie night," she suggested. "Maybe show films that focus on social justice themes, followed by discussions. And we could have cookouts where officers can join residents, sharing food and stories." Marcus nodded, envisioning the potential for connection in such gatherings. "That's brilliant, Sarah. It's all about making these interactions feel natural and inviting. We can also invite local leaders to speak at the workshops, emphasizing the importance of community involvement in policing." Their brainstorming session quickly turned into a collaborative effort to outline the events. They discussed logistics, potential challenges, and the necessary outreach to ensure community participation. As they planned, Marcus felt a renewed sense of purpose wash over him. They were not just organizing events, they were laying the foundation for a legacy of change that would transcend their immediate community. "Let's call it Summer of Unity," Marcus suggested. "It's a way to promote understanding and celebrate our diversity." As they finalized the details, the excitement in the air was palpable. Marcus knew that these events could serve as a model for other precincts around the city and beyond. They could demonstrate that when communities and law enforcement worked together, transformative change was possible. Over the next few weeks, they put their plans into action. Flyers were distributed throughout the neighborhood, social media campaigns were launched, and community meetings were held to drum up interest. Slowly but surely, excitement began to build. The first event, a community movie night, was set for a Friday evening in Riverside Park. As the day approached, Marcus felt a mix of anticipation and nervousness. Would people come? Would they engage? He knew that the success of the Summer of Unity depended on building trust and fostering connections. On the night of the event, the park was filled with laughter and the warm glow of string lights illuminating the gathering area. Families set up picnic blankets and children ran around excitedly. Marcus walked around, greeting attendees and welcoming officers who had come to participate. As the sun set and the stars began to twinkle overhead, he took the stage, standing before a diverse crowd of residents and officers. "Welcome, everyone, to the first night of our Summer of Unity," he called out, his voice filled with enthusiasm. "Tonight, we gather not just to watch a film, but to connect, share stories, and build relationships. This is our opportunity to come together as a community, united in our pursuit of understanding and justice." The crowd erupted in applause, and Marcus felt the energy surging through the park. As the film began to play, he watched the faces around him, captivated by the story unfolding on screen. After the film, they held a discussion where attendees could express their thoughts and share personal experiences related to the themes of the movie. As the night progressed, the conversations flowed freely. Marcus was struck by the heartfelt stories shared by both residents and officers. They laughed, cried, and connected in ways that had once felt impossible. It was a reminder of the power of storytelling in bridging divides and fostering understanding. At the end of the night, Sarah approached Marcus, her eyes shining with excitement. "This was amazing. We have to keep this going. I can't believe how many people came out." "I know," Marcus replied, his heart full. "This is just the beginning. We have so much potential to create real change in our community." As the weeks rolled on, the Summer of Unity continued with success, each event drawing larger crowds and deepening connections. Workshops were held where residents and officers engaged in discussions about their roles and experiences, fostering a new level of understanding. By the end of the summer, the community felt transformed. People who had once avoided each other began to greet one another warmly. Officers were no longer seen as distant authority figures, but as integral members of the community who were willing to listen and engage. The culmination of the summer series came with a large community picnic, complete with food, music, and activities for all ages. Marcus stood at the forefront, feeling the deep sense of pride as he looked around at the diverse crowd enjoying the day. As the event progressed, he took a moment to reflect on how far they had come since that day in the park when he had faced unwarranted suspicion. The work they had done had sparked a movement, one that would leave a lasting impact on their community. As the sun began to set, casting a warm glow over the park, Marcus stepped up to the microphone once again. "Thank you all for being here today," he said, his voice carrying over the chatter. "This summer has been incredible, and it's a testament to what we can achieve when we come together. We've built relationships that will last far beyond this season, and I hope we can continue to foster this spirit of unity." The crowd erupted in applause, and Marcus felt a swell of emotion. He was grateful for the opportunity to be part of such a transformative experience, one that challenged preconceived notions and dismantled barriers. As the event drew to a close, Marcus made a commitment to himself and to the community. He would ensure that the progress they had made would not be forgotten. It would serve as a foundation for future generations. In the months that followed, the initiatives they had launched continued to grow. The Community Advisory Board began meeting regularly, collaborating with the precinct on strategies to improve policing and strengthen community ties. Marcus remained a driving force in these discussions, advocating for transparency, accountability, and ongoing dialogue. The legacy of the Summer of Unity began to ripple outwards, inspiring other precincts and neighboring communities to adopt similar programs. Officers from across the city reached out to learn from their experiences, eager to implement the changes that had taken root in Marcus's neighborhood. And as the seasons change, Marcus knew that the work was far from over. There were still challenges to face, but the resilience of the community and their commitment to justice would guide them forward. As he looked back on that fateful day in the park when everything had begun, he felt a deep sense of gratitude. What had once been an encounter rooted in bias had transformed into a movement that fostered hope, understanding, and change. He realized that sometimes it takes a single moment, a spark of injustice, to ignite a flame of change that can light the way for others. And with that thought, Marcus knew that together, they would continue to build a legacy that would inspire future generations to stand up for justice, equity, and community. The road ahead. As the leaves began to change color, signaling the arrival of autumn, the community's spirit remained vibrant and hopeful. The success of the Summer of Unity had laid a solid foundation for ongoing dialogue and collaboration between law enforcement and residents. Marcus Davis felt invigorated as he walked through Riverside Park, a place that had once been tainted by suspicion, but now blossomed with unity and understanding. The Community Advisory Board had established itself as a vital part of the precinct's operations, meeting regularly to discuss ongoing issues and propose solutions. Marcus often found himself leading these meetings, a role he embraced with passion and commitment. He recognized that the real work lay ahead, and he was determined to ensure that the momentum they had built would not fizzle out. One brisk evening, Marcus prepared for a significant meeting with the City Council to discuss funding for community initiatives. He meticulously organized his notes, emphasizing the need for sustained support for training programs, community events, and the advisory board itself. He was acutely aware that funding would be crucial to keeping their momentum alive. As he arrived at the council chambers, he was greeted by familiar faces, community members who had become allies in the pursuit of justice, and city officials eager to hear about the changes taking place. The atmosphere buzzed with anticipation, and Marcus felt a mixture of excitement and nerves. This was a pivotal moment that could shape the future of their initiatives. The meeting commenced, and Marcus took the podium. "Thank you for allowing me to speak today," he began, projecting confidence despite the butterflies in his stomach. "Today, I want to share the incredible progress we've made in bridging the gap between law enforcement and the community." He recounted the events of the summer, the community movie nights, the workshops, and the meaningful conversations that had taken place. He highlighted how the precinct had become more engaged with the community, with officers attending neighborhood meetings and participating in local events. These initiatives have not only strengthened relationships, but have also fostered a sense of trust that is essential for effective policing, Marcus stated, his voice steady. As he spoke, he could see the council members leaning forward, engaged in his words. He detailed the testimonials from residents who had experienced a shift in their perceptions of law enforcement, sharing stories of newfound friendships and collaborations that had blossomed from their efforts. However, Marcus continued, "We cannot rest on our laurels. We need to ensure that these changes are sustained and deepened. Funding for ongoing training and community engagement is crucial. Without it, we risk falling back into old habits and misunderstandings." After his presentation, Marcus felt a wave of support from those present. The council members were moved by the stories he shared and acknowledged the importance of continued investment in community relations. They deliberated, discussing how the city could allocate resources to support the initiatives. A city councilwoman named Maria, who had been particularly supportive of the movement, stood up to speak. "Marcus, thank you for your inspiring words. What you've accomplished is remarkable, and it's clear that the community is ready for more. I propose we allocate funds to support the expansion of your initiatives, including training programs for officers and additional community events." Applause broke out in the chamber, and Marcus felt a swell of pride. This was a significant victory, a recognition of the hard work that had gone into changing perceptions and fostering relationships. The meeting concluded with a commitment from the city council to support the initiatives, and Marcus walked out feeling empowered. He knew that this was just the beginning of a larger movement, one that would require ongoing dedication and perseverance. In the following months, Marcus worked tirelessly to implement the council's commitment. They launched new training programs for officers, emphasizing empathy, cultural competency, and effective communication. Residents were invited to participate in these sessions, ensuring that officers heard firsthand accounts of the community's experiences. The advisory board also expanded its reach, welcoming new members who brought diverse perspectives to the table. Together, they discussed pressing issues, from mental health crisis to youth engagement, brainstorming strategies to address these challenges collaboratively. One of the most exciting developments was the introduction of a youth mentorship program. Recognizing the importance of connecting with younger generations, Marcus and the advisory board partnered with local schools to create a program that paired officers with students. The goal was to build trust and understanding from an early age, showing young people that law enforcement could be allies rather than adversaries. The first mentorship event was held at a local high school gym, filled with laughter and excitement as students mingled with officers. Marcus watched as they played games, shared stories, and engaged in activities designed to break down barriers. It was a sight to behold. Young people who had once viewed officers with skepticism were now sharing pizza and laughing together. During the event, one of the students, a bright young woman named Jasmine, approached Marcus. "Thank you for doing this," she said, her voice earnest. "It's nice to see officers in a different light. I never thought I'd feel comfortable talking to one." Marcus smiled, feeling the warmth spread through him. "That's exactly why we're here, Jasmine. We want to show you that we're all part of the same community. You matter to us." As the mentorship program continued to grow, Marcus witnessed the transformative power of connection. Students began to share their aspirations, dreams, and concerns with the officers, fostering relationships that would last long after the program concluded. Yet, as the months progressed, Marcus knew that challenges still lay ahead. The journey toward equity and understanding was not linear. It was filled with setbacks, misunderstandings, and hard conversations. He remained vigilant, ensuring that the community and the precinct continued to engage in dialogue even when tensions flared. One evening, as he sat in his office reviewing feedback from recent events, he received a call from Brian Harkins. "Marcus, I think we need to have a sit-down," Brian said, his tone serious. "Of course. What's on your mind?" Marcus asked, sensing the gravity in Brian's voice. "I've noticed some tension brewing within the department," Brian admitted. "Some officers are struggling to adapt to the changes we've implemented, and there's a sense of resistance among a few. I think we need to address this head-on before it becomes a bigger issue." Marcus nodded, understanding the importance of tackling the underlying concerns. "Let's organize a meeting with the officers who are feeling this way. We can create a safe space for them to voice their concerns and offer support." As they discussed the logistics, Marcus felt a renewed sense of purpose. The journey they were on was about more than just community events. It was about creating lasting cultural change within the precinct. It would require patience, understanding, and a willingness to confront uncomfortable truths. The meeting was scheduled for the following week, and Marcus arrived prepared to listen. He knew that for true change to take root, it was essential to acknowledge the fears and frustrations of those who felt threatened by the evolving dynamics. As the officers gathered in the precinct conference room, there was an air of tension. Marcus sensed their apprehension, but he also saw the determination in their eyes. They wanted to be part of the solution, but some felt lost in the transition. "Thank you all for coming," Marcus began, his tone inviting and open. "Today, I want to create a space for us to talk openly about the changes we've been implementing. It's essential that we address any concerns you may have." One officer, a veteran named Tom, spoke up. "I appreciate what you're trying to do, Marcus, but I'll be honest. Some of us feel like these changes are happening too quickly. It's hard to adapt when we've been doing things a certain way for so long. Marcus nodded, recognizing the validity of his concerns. I understand that change can be uncomfortable, and it's natural to feel apprehensive. What can we do to support you in this transition? Another officer chimed in. I think we need more training sessions that focus on real-world scenarios. It would help us see how we can apply these new principles in our daily interactions. That's a great idea, Marcus responded. We can develop scenario-based training that allows you to practice these skills in a controlled environment. It's all about building confidence in these new approaches. As the conversation continued, Marcus felt the tension begin to dissolve. Officers expressed their fears, frustrations, and hopes for the future. By the end of the meeting, there was a palpable shift in the room. They were no longer just participants in a program. They were active contributors to a movement for change. After the meeting, Brian approached Marcus, a grateful expression on his face. Thank you for handling that so well. I think we made real progress today. Marcus smiled, feeling encouraged. It's all about listening and creating a culture where everyone feels valued. We can't forget that this journey is ongoing, and we need to support each other through it. As winter approached, Marcus reflected on the growth they had experienced. The community's spirit was stronger than ever, and the relationships formed between residents and officers were beginning to bear fruit. Yet he knew that the fight for justice was far from over. In the quiet moments, he often thought about that day in Riverside Park when everything had changed. The journey had led him to a place of purpose and commitment, one that would continue to shape his life and the lives of those around him. With the groundwork laid for ongoing dialogue and collaboration, Marcus was determined to ensure that the legacy of the Summer of Unity would be carried forward, inspiring future generations to challenge injustice and foster understanding. And as the first snowflakes began to fall, blanketing the city in a quiet hush, Marcus felt a deep sense of hope. He knew that the path ahead would be filled with challenges, but together they would navigate them, united in their commitment to justice, equity, and community.